All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming and joining us today. So I'm Brian Moskalik, and I'll be co-presenting this with Annie Morrison. And this whole thing stemmed from side conversations that he and I have because we share an office together. So we get together and we kind of commiserate during our office hours, and we talk about, why do students do this, or why can't I get them to learn this, and why is this student talking to me about things on the syllabus that are clearly in black and white and they're just not getting it. And then we started to kind of geek out and say, well, I've been reading this book, and then we started talking about kind of things about brain and brain development and learning. And I was like, wow, that would be a cool EduCon. Would you be interested in joining me? And he was like, yeah, sure, let's do that, and we'll geek out in public. So this is the product of those interactions. So really, the first thing here, introduction, kind of what we're going over here. So we want to talk about what learning is. Now, I will tell you, I'm not a neurobiologist. My training and my background is not in that area. So a lot of this stems from me just reading material and going over it. Now, I did teach that stuff a long time ago, but my formal education is in animal behavior, communication, ecology, and evolution. So that's like where all of this interest comes from, is the fact that we are the product of having this massive brain and a lot of stuff that we can do with it. And it's really a cool thing to try and understand. All right, so we'll talk a bit about the anatomy and physiology of the brain and neurons. And then we'll talk about some tactics to increase long-term memory storage. And that's really the goal, right? We want our students to walk out of here knowing stuff. And how can we encourage them to do it? Now, again, we can only go so far. We can only bring so much to them, but we can encourage them to take additional steps to solidify that information, right? So then what is learning? So when we look at learning, what are we really trying to accomplish? And this is a change in behavior because of something you've done, experience, right? So something you've studied, something you've gone through, something you've been taught. So this change in behavior. Well, then we have to assess, well, what is behavior? And again, that's my area, so I like to talk about these things. So this is an action or response to a particular stimulus or situation. So when you're in a given circumstance like this, like, you can't help certain behaviors that you're doing right now. Like, I can feel that you're just ecstatic and you're so excited to be here. But there are so many other behaviors that you are capable of controlling, right? Your ability to subdue that kind of emotion, that expression, like you're so happy, but now, like, I can see you're all calm and relaxed. I know you're controlling that, right? But we as educators, again, we rely on all of this, and this is interaction, right? This is communication, this is give and take. So we have a bunch of tools at our disposal that will stimulate and facilitate learning and the acquisition of knowledge, but it's the retention that becomes a problem, right? Because I'm going to teach you all about this stuff, and unless you go and do something with it, you're going to forget about it by the time you make it to lunch after you've left here. So those are some of the issues that we really need to address, and that's really kind of the goal of all this kind of stuff. Now, we use inspiration and things like that and are modeling our behaviors, and we hear these phrases like sage on the stage and all those kinds of things, and they have their place as long as they're used appropriately in the context of learning, right? When we give students something like an exploratory situation and we're like, here, go find the answer to this, a lot of time is wasted and a lot of opportunity to kind of work as a team is lost when they are scrambling through books or Googling all this information and so on. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all practice to teaching. And that's really kind of the gist of all this reading and background stuff that I've gone through, is that really everything is contextual. Whatever you're trying to get across, there may be a better way, or maybe what you're doing is the best way, right? And then you just need to hone that craft. All right. So the first thing really is pointing out the brain. Now, there's a lot of text up here, and really, we all have a brain. We brought our brain today. So really, talk to your neighbor about your brain and talk to them about how it works, because we all have it, we all use it, so we all must know how it works, right? So go ahead, take a minute, talk to your neighbor and say, yeah, this is how my brain works. All right, awesome, awesome. A lot of good conversation out there. I'm hearing a lot of good things. And teachers actually make the best students, I think, right? This is quite different than the medical field, right? Doctors don't make good patients kind of thing. Teachers are the best students. But if we look across, back with me now, people, back with me, let's clap 3 times, all that kind of stuff, right? So when we look across the brain, we divide it into regions, and various regions of the brain are responsible for different activities that we carry out, right? So something like smell recognition and speech in the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, where we're kind of integrating information about our surroundings and our place in the environment, right? Occipital lobe, where we start processing things through vision, but it's actually passing all the way through the brain from the front to the back, and then it carries out a bunch of other actions when it starts associating with other parts of the brain. And then the temporal brain, where we start to get into smell recognition and aspects of music. So somebody was talking about music earlier. So we'll talk about these things and kind of how they relate, because really this big mass, this thing right here, is a collection of specific nerve types called neurons, right? So we look at these things, and these are actually what the currency of all this stuff is. So these are interacting and communicating, and they're growing, and some of them are dying off, some of them are being removed, some of them are being honed, and we'll talk about this process, but overall we need to know a little bit about the general anatomy. So when we look at a neuron, it's got all of these little tendrils, these things sticking out here, and these are referred to as dendrites. And then we've got this long part of it called the axon, and this is where we're sending information to potentially another neuron or an organ or a gland or something like that. All right. At the end, we've got these terminal regions here, and this is where we're going to be sending out some chemical communication. So this is going to be able to emit signals and send on information. The body is where we're containing the nucleus, and then there's a region here called the axon hillock, and we'll come to that a little bit later, because that's really the gateway to this whole system. We have to get enough stimulation into this thing in order to pass through what we call the axon hillock and get that pulse, get that information to go on. Now, there's a ton of physiology that goes into this, and that really we could spend a lot of time on, but really it's the process of how neurons do their job that matters, all right, for us in this conversation. Okay, myelin is just a casing that helps speed it up. Some neurons have it, some neurons don't. Okay, any questions with that? We're good here? Cool, all right, on we go. So these are just some examples of neurons that you'll be familiar with around your body, right? So some for touch or somatosensory, the feeling of heat or cold, the feeling of pressure on your body, all of those things. All right, auditory, you're using that right now. So whenever I'm sending this information into the environment, you're perceiving it, it's vibrating in your ears and stimulating this pathway. Visual, we're doing that right now as well, right? So the thing that's amazing to me about this whole system is no matter what the stimulus input is, it all becomes the same thing. When we internalize this into our bodies, it becomes the same type of mechanism, the same pathway. It all becomes what we call a depolarization event. It's going to send this information down these long axons, and that is what we use to interpret our environment. And that's really an amazing thing because it all becomes the same. All right. So how do we get through this and how do we look at these? Well, sometimes we have neurons that interact directly with other neurons that they are targeting, and this will facilitate it. So in this case, we've got pre and post coincidence, and the pre and post refers to this little space here between these two. So if this neuron here is active and it triggers this neuron down here, we might get the response that we're looking for. And we may have additional neurons that are participating in this, but they may not be active all the time, or they may turn on sometimes and not others. And they may be able to interact with this neuron as well and potentially stimulate it or not. All right, we'll talk about the consequences of those things when we get to some more examples. We also have pre-modulatory, where we have one neuron that interacts with another neuron prior to stimulating our response neurons. And this can increase the likelihood of this event or this firing to happen. So we can cause this one to trigger this one and make it act kind of with more strength. It releases more transmitters, it releases more chemicals, and then that will eventually turn this one on. Okay, so there's a couple different pathways neurons can take when they're trying to trigger a response. That's the gist. And the point of this is that you're getting information from your visual cues, you're getting information from your auditory cues, your tactile senses, and your body has to figure out what's important. And a great example of this I do all the time is like, right now, I'm the most important thing in your world. It makes me feel really good about myself to say that. But when I stop, all of a sudden, all of your other senses kind of kick in and you start to hear the fans and you start to hear the hum and you start to hear everything else because your body is trying to find the next most important thing. What's going to happen next? What's dangerous or what's interesting, right? So our bodies are tuned for this. And a lot of what we do is actually filter everything out. Most of the stimuli around your body is just being filtered out constantly. And your job is to determine what's the most important. And right now it's me. Thanks. All right, so this is a way better drawing than what I had before with more detail and focusing on those interactions. Now, these neurons, again, are generalized. Neurons are going to vary depending on what kind of stimulus they're taking in, how many dendrites they have, whether or not they're interacting with tons of other neurons, or whether or not there's a very specific linear thing. Very simple reactions from stimulus to response are things like reflexes, right? And we know reflexes. We don't have to think about that. You touch something hot, you take your hand away, boom. The second that you have to start thinking about stuff, that reflex is no longer useful and you just burned your hand, right? So what we're trying to do is we're talking about that middle part. How do we get integration to be more effective for our students, right? Where they have to stop and think about it. And this all comes down to this cellular communication here, these neural communication, neurotransmitters, and we could talk about neurotransmitters all day, probably all month if we wanted to. But the main thing is that this is that communication. This is where it's all coming from, all right? All right, now this is going to get deep because this is kind of how I think. So now you're seeing my brain on paper and it's going to get a little weird here. All right, so this is your brain or my brain, all right? And what I've got here are a bunch of words, and most of them, hopefully all of them, are familiar to us, right? So when you look at these words, you're like, oh, I know what a tumor is. I remember learning about that. I remember reading about it. I remember hearing about that. And that pathways always are already well established, okay? So the words represent their neuron pathways. These are things you've already learned, right? So how do we take that information and what students walk into our classroom with, and how do we start building on that in the neurosense? So if we, in this case, today we're going to learn a song, all right? So we're gonna integrate some music, as we had mentioned, and we're going to learn a song. So if I start teaching you a song, our new little neuron friend up here, all right, is going to start growing. It's being stimulated. The activity of this neuron is now in its kind of learning phase, and it's looking to root and find connections where we can memorize and learn this song. All right, so as it starts to grow, it'll start to do what we call arborization. It'll start to stretch out, and it'll send out more of its terminals and connections in order to try and facilitate and complete this network to create what would be a memory. Right? But this is only going to be short term for now because it's still in its learning phase. It's still trying to make those connections. As it continues to grow, it'll make more arborizations and it'll find new things to root into. All right. But as we start learning this and we start practicing, we start rehearsing our song, it'll start to kind of hone its ability to find that one pathway and keep that root, that main kind of tract of information available, okay? So when we start looking at it, it'll prune things that are ineffective and that don't fire along with it, and it'll start to hone in and invest more in those that do. And if I start doing something like da 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 da, right? What song is it? Happy Birthday, right? So and you can see that your neurons would have locked into the words that follow that sequence because of your memory. And now you've learned that song in accordance with that music because we've got roots for multiple inputs up here. All right, so that's what our students are doing. We are talking to them, we are giving them experiences, they are making these pathways and establishing them, but they need the honing process to continue. All right, short-term memory is very short. So if they're not practicing right away within 20 minutes, we've lost 40%. You remember only 60. Within a day, you're down to 30. If you're lucky, I mean, these are averages. So, I mean, there's going to be an upper and lower limit here. But if we start to practice and rehearse again within that day, and we do it again, we can retain up to 80% of that information. That's a significant jump from 30. And this is why we tell students, go home and study this. 3 hours outside for every hour inside, all of that stuff, because this is what they need to do it. And it's the time frame they do it in that matters. If they wait to the end of the week or right before the exam to cram this stuff, all of those little dendrites that have been touching and communicating and all those terminal ends, they're already gone. And now they have to reestablish them again. So the process takes time to grow. All right. Long-term storage, once we get past that and we've established that pathway, this is just the likelihood that we're going to be able to recall this event well into the future. There's still lots of research going on in this area, and it's associated with these phosphogenes. You'll see a lot of that in the literature if you're looking for it. But really, we're still learning about how long-term storage works and how to facilitate it and increase it more efficiently. All right, so ways we can do this as educators: curriculum design, the way we organize and structure our courses, right? We have to keep them on their toes. We have to keep them knowing that tomorrow there could be questions. There could be an explanation, a discussion, something I have to be accountable for all the time, because that's going to make them close the window on how long they're waiting before they're studying again, right? Group discussion questions are great because then they're able to say it in their own words, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then interleaving content and active note taking. That's kind of where I'll kind of focus my talk before I hand off over here in a second. All right, so when we look at interleaving and learning, a lot of times we learn things in blocks. All right, and I'll blow this up. This picture, the text is a little small, but it's the images that you're after. And active note taking, in kind of the perspective that we need students to take this, is putting it in their own words. If they're not putting it in their words, they're putting them in your words. And my words are mine, and I speak the way I speak. You don't speak the way I speak. And when you regurgitate my words back to me, I'm like, yes, I know that's what I sound like. What do you think it sounds like? What do you do to explain this? And I tell my students, explain this to a 6-year-old, explain it to your neighbor, explain it to somebody, and make the terms useful to you in your conversation. Because I like the 50-cent words all day, but they may not, because they may not know what they are. And they're still learning that, and that's part of it too. All right, so active note taking is built into all of this. All right, so just think they have to be using their own words. All right, so why does this work? We often learn things in blocks. So for my example here, because I teach biology and things like that, maybe this is the introductory part of chemistry, right? And then we're going to tie that together. We're going to learn about water and how all of these atoms come together to form these water molecules and the interactions of the water molecules. And then from there, we're going to learn about what we call the biomacros, proteins and nucleic acids and things like that, right? And once we leave chapter 2, well, that has, its place there. We're done with that. We don't have to worry about chapter 2 ever again. And that's the way students think. And that's not how it works in reality, right? We take atoms to build molecules because they're going to interact and they're going to cause life functions, right? This is all building and building and building. And students want to treat them like little silos. And the problem that we find with that is once they're in silos, there's no overlap. And therefore, once you go to water, they've lost the context of atoms. And once you're in biomacros, they don't understand the interactions between water and the atoms and everything else, and how they're bonded and how they're interacting and forming things together. So these arrows here just represent pathways. Imagine those as being neurons, okay? So once we start interleaving this, now interleaving is mixing it and trying to break down those blocks and show the relevance of material across given topics, or maybe just chapters in this content, right? So now all of a sudden we've got atoms, and we can understand that there's going to be links between atoms and water, and what those links are. How are they bonded together? And once we start looking, well, we've got water with these properties. Now all of a sudden, water is showing us unique characteristics, which is really cool. And then if we interleave that even more, we have more potential for interactions. And this is where things like critical thinking come in, because now we have to compare and contrast. And we have to show, well, these are similar because, and these are different because. And that gives us that level of mastery that we're looking for from our students, right? So when we start looking at interleaving, having them putting it in their own words and giving them the opportunity to compare and contrast, we really start to establish those long-term connections. And the familiarity is really what's going to drive home that long-term memory. All right, this is where I stop, and I'll hand it off. And if you have any questions, we'll take them at the end.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I'm really excited to be a part of this because I get to start by telling you a story that almost always comes up in my classes. And this is a story about a horse. This horse. So this horse is not just any ordinary horse. This horse is arguably the smartest horse that ever lived. Okay, this horse was owned by this man, the man in the white coat, whose name was Wilhelm van Olsen. That's correct. Who lived in Germany in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And you guys get the benefit, since I was like reviewing all this stuff. I'm going to tell you this story, but when I was reviewing and preparing for this presentation, I realized that the story I've been telling my students wasn't always factually correct. So you get the benefit of the more factually correct version of this story. So von Oslen, I think is Van Oslen was a former math teacher, actually, and he had this idea that animals could be taught to do things, especially math, as a former math teacher. And he tried with a lot of animals, but he was most successful in teaching his horse. His horse's name was Hans. And so Hans became known as Clever Hans, because Clever Hans could learned math, right? This college, right? All right. And so after von Oslen taught his horse to do some math, the next obvious thing to do was to take the horse out into the world and show people how this worked and that the horse could do math. And so he would take his horse all over the country, different places, and say, hey, come gather around, see my horse do math. All right. And so everybody come gather around, and he'd say to Hans, okay, what's 2 + 2? Right. And so Clever Hans would start stomping his hoof. And then he'd stop. And we're like, oh, that's amazing, right? And so then he'd say, well, I mean, my horse is really smart, right? Not only can he add, subtract, divide, multiply, he can do square roots, all right? But not logarithms. Like, I mean, he's a smart horse, but not like a genius, okay? So he'd say, what's the Clever Hans? What's the square root of 9? And he'd stop. And I was like, what is going on? But then there was always this knucklehead in the back of the crowd being like, I bet you trained him. I bet you trained him on those first 2. Let me ask a question, right? And so von Oslen would say, okay, cool. Ask whatever question you want. And so he could ask something like, what's 5 - 3? And stop. It was amazing. And eventually, after doing it several days, Clever Hans would get a sugar cube, right? And he'd go on, and everybody's like, wow, this must mean that, you have taught your horse how to do math, right? But of course, that's not what was actually going on, right? What was actually going on, and to be fair, his owner didn't know what was going on. Right? His owner actually believed that the horse could do math. But Clever Hans didn't know anything about math. But he did know that if he paid attention to everyone who was around him and looked for the subtle cues that those people were giving off, that if he stopped right when people would lean in just a little bit, if he stopped stomping his feet, he knew he was going to get that sugar cube. All right? So now, how does this relate to our classes? And why do I tell my students this story often? Not every semester do I tell this, but a lot. I feel like our students are really, really good, or they like to be really good at playing what I call the game of school. The game of school works something like this. Students come to class, you as an instructor, you pose a question, the student volunteers an answer, right? And what the student is really, really looking for after you have posed the question, they give you the answer. They're looking for your face to light up and smile. And, oh, you're right. Oh, you got it. And because then they feel like they get a reward, right? Because the reward is, well, I got the question right, so I must know what I'm doing, right? But in that process, a lot of times I find, at least in my classes, that they're not really thinking about the problem. They're just focused on that answer. I don't want you to be focused on the answer. I want you to be focused on how you got to that answer so we can have that discussion. And that's a more difficult thing to talk about in terms of what we're doing with our classes. So here's what I find, or where I think there's some neuroscience that's going on here. So a few of our students want this. This is the Pavlovian response, where there's some sort of stimulus, and then stimulus, and then there's going to be a reward, and there's this increase in dopamine that, you know, before you get the reward, right? Some of our students really want that. They get that, you know, the stimulus, and then they get the reward. But actually, I think what's more likely going on is that a lot of our students want this, and this is where the students this. Our students want this. Our students get a stimulus, and then they do something, right? They give the question, and then they get the reward, right? After they've done something. And this is operant conditioning, right? Cue, they do something, they get a reward, right? Okay. And it's tied, I think, to dopamine. Right, so what is dopamine? The chemist would tell me that this is dopamine, but that's not what I mean. All right. So, by the way, I'm going to mention that I hope that I know in the span of a 40-minute or hour-long talk, we're not going to be able to do this perfectly. But I hope that you're noticing that Brian and I are employing some of the strategies that we're trying to tell you to do along the way. Okay. So dopamine's a chemical released by neurons to send signals to other nerve cells. That is a neurotransmitter. It is related to these things. Oh, I'll ask you a question. So it's related to motivation and rewards. Has anybody heard of dopamine before today? All right, what would you say dopamine is known as? Or what would you have said before I started talking about it? Happiness, rewards. A lot of people have talked about it as the pleasure molecule. This is where it's in popular vernacular. It's often known as that. But it seems like that the belief now is that the dopamine is not this thing that like you're addicted to, and that you're I used to think like my students, they were looking for that hit of dopamine, but they're looking for the reward is what they're really looking for. And it turns out that the surge in dopamine precedes getting the reward, right? And so there is this connection here, but what I'm trying to do with my students is find ways to motivate more intrinsic motivation and intrinsic seeking of rewards, rather than the extrinsic things like I'm giving you the big smile, I'm saying that's great, I'm going to give you points or whatever. I'm trying to do things that motivate them for their own self to learn these sorts of things. One of the ways that you can stimulate that reward seeking in a more intrinsic motivated way, and it's associated with increases in dopamine, is by trying to develop curiosity. Right? And there are different types of curiosity. There's these 4 main types of curiosity, but we're going to end up focusing on 2 of them that are important for learning. So, all right, so the first type here is empathic curiosity. This is like if you're wondering about what's going on with other people, like what's going on in their lives, you're curious about your friends, whatever, that's empathic curiosity. You want to know, hey, what's that guy thinking? What's she thinking about? What's going on? That's one type. Morbid curiosity, I think, is really interesting. And this is, you're really curious about things that are dangerous. It's not necessarily related to death, right? Although this is the sort of curiosity that causes everybody to slow down when there's an accident, right? Because you got that morbid curiosity, like what was, and there's some, deep reasons for that, because it's a way of us learning about our environment and hopefully protecting ourselves from those sorts of dangerous things. But the two types that are more closely related to learning are perceptual and epistemic curiosity. So perceptual curiosity is you're presented with some sort of novel stimuli that you think, hey, I need to go explore that more. It's the sort of curiosity you get when you're out on a hike and you're like, I wonder what's around this corner, or I wonder what's down that valley. Or if you're out exploring the city, you're like, oh, what's the next block got that this block doesn't have? That's the type of perceptual curiosity that sort of keeps you going, right? Especially when you're in new places. But epistemic curiosity, which has sort of two subtypes, this is the desire for knowledge based on discovering new ideas, right? And as a scientist, that really speaks to me, but I really think it's applicable to all divisions, all departments, all pursuits, right? So this is the type of, the two types of epistemic curiosity, specific and diversive, all right? And so diversive curiosity is, and both of them are tied to reward seeking and elevated levels of dopamine, but diversive curiosity that's driven by boredom, right? So that's the type of curiosity that you're seeking. You're seeking rewards when you are bored and you pull out your phone and you start scrolling. You're curious about something. You just want something to fill your time, right? We're trying to avoid that, right, with our students, right? But the specific curiosity is when you really want to know one specific thing. Like there's a puzzle you're trying to solve. Like if you're working on a crossword puzzle specifically, you're like, I should know this one word. I can't figure it out. But that's you're being stimulated by that, and you're driven to know that. But we can harness that type of curiosity in our classes and get students to focus on their drive, their own personal drive for understanding the material, learning the new things, which will elevate their dopamine levels and motivate their own intrinsic desire to learn new things. All right, so Brian talked a little bit about short-term memory is really short. This is based on a study that has been replicated many, many, many times, but there was a psychologist, Ebbinghaus, who tried to learn nonsense words. He basically said, I want to memorize as many nonsense words as I can and then test myself on how many I remember over time. And this is the curve that he developed in terms of the ability to retain things over a period of minutes to days, right? Almost a month here. And so, like I said, this has been replicated many times in different contexts. And so what do you do about this? Well, what you do is you space out your review of that material. And it turns out that every time you review things, the forgetting part of it is extended. So if we're stimulating those neurons and building the dendrites and all the things, Brian said he's not a neurobiologist. I'm not even a biologist. So the rest of you will forgive me. But when you're building those pathways and keeping them refreshed, then you can retain things for longer as you're spacing things out. So this idea of spaced repetition, I think, is like super important, and the concept of interleaving the material that Brian talked about is also related to this, because if we can build in the review into our course, then we're helping the students have this spaced repetition that helps them get all that material into the long-term memory. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about some things that students can do that are really effective study strategies, and I'm risking a little bit I'm going to show you some of the things that are maybe not great effective study strategies. So the first one is I think one of the easiest strategies to come up with that our students probably go to a lot, which is just rereading, reviewing, whatever. And this is probably one of the least effective types of study strategies for students, because it's too easy for students to just like think that they already know the material as they're reading it or rereading it and be like, yep, I got it. Yep, I got it. And there's no actual engagement with the neurons in those pathways, right? So rereading is not a great study strategy. It's not that rereading isn't important or useful, but as a strategy to get things into long-term memory, not the greatest. The next one, highlighting, which I actually encourage my students to do, but in a very specific way. So highlighting also turns out to be not a great study strategy long-term for the same reason. It's you feel like you're actively engaged with it, but you're not actually, you're just going over the thing with a yellow marker, right? And that's not actually engaging with the material and helping to build and rebuild those pathways that Brian was talking about. Now, the way that this can be used is if you use highlighting at the start of studying. If you use the highlighting at the start of studying as a part of the active note-taking method, that can be a good thing to do. But in terms of like reviewing and preparing for things like quizzes, exams, tests, other assessments, not a great study strategy. Self-testing is considered a good study strategy. And this is a thing that I think is very hard for students to do. But when they do it and when they do it effectively, they're really, they benefit greatly from this. And this is the sort of thing where if students are making the or using the active note-taking approach, they can use those notes that they've taken to actually do the self-testing themselves. So one example is something I don't do and I haven't taught my students to do. I'd love to learn to become better at this, but there's the you heard of the Cornell note-taking methods? So if you're using the Cornell note-taking methods, you end up with a page that is broken up into different sections. And what students can do is they can cover up part of the page and do their own self-testing off of that. And it's really powerful. In things like science or math classes, students can find their own practice problems, or you can give them practice problems, which help them for their own self-testing. This is a thing. It's not easy. It is effortful. It takes a lot of effort, but it's high impact in terms of their learning. And then distributed practice is also, again, going back to what Brian was saying. This is the sort of thing where you can't cram, right? And you can't, even if you're working ahead, right? We have students who, they'll learn something on a Monday, right? And they know a week from Monday, there's going to be a test, right? So their idea is like, okay, Tuesday, I'm off of work. I'm going to like spend 6 hours doing all this stuff on Tuesday, and then I'm ready for my test the next Monday, right? But that doesn't work, right? You need to, instead of doing 6 hours on Tuesday, you should do an hour every day over the next 6 days. Right. So this is a thing that is a really good method for teaching and studying. All right. So actually brings me to the end of what I have to say. We put together a whole bunch of resources. If you go to this link, which is the same as this QR code. All right. So I don't know how you like that QR code or link. That'll take you to a notebook, OneNote notebook. Hopefully there's a bunch of things that you can see there, with links to things like apps for doing spaced repetition. There's a website that I just love a bunch. It's like it's an interactive site. It's called How to Remember Almost Anything Forever-ish, or something like that. But it's like an interactive thing where you practice spaced repetition along with it, and you're learning about spaced repetition. And from that page, there's links to not just apps where you can have students like build their own spaced repetition strategies. The most popular app is called Anki. But there's also a way where you could just build a system in a shoebox for spaced repetition. It's something called a Lightner box, where you get a schedule of how to review things and how to build like meaningful flashcards. But there's a ton of other resources in this OneNote, so I encourage you to do that. The QR code for your attendance is right there. The code word is peach. I thank you so much for coming and for your attendance, and I'd love to take any of your questions and pass them off to Brian. So thank you.
Andy, were you disappointed no one gave you a sugar cube when you got it?
A little bit. That's what I'm highly motivated by sugar cubes, usually in the form of chocolate and peanut butter mixed together.
I just looked up Clever Hans, and he was eaten by soldiers during World War I.
Yes. That doesn't usually come up in our talk, but yeah, in our class.
Morbid curiosity.
Yeah, there you go. Right. Absolutely, yeah.
I think there's more question about the neurology and the neurobiology. I think I have kind of an outdated understanding, but is that meaning that these axons and neurons are growing like as people are learning?
Yes.
Like
and
in real time?
Yeah, and it used to be mythology that we stopped, adding brain cells and things like that. We just know the rates are far slower, and things will continue to develop. And with new research, especially in mycology, where they're showing that mushrooms actually promote
Lion's mane.
Yeah, lion's mane promotes brain growth, and things like meditation actually increase the amount of gray matter in the brain and the ability for kind of finding like calm in your brain, because a lot of us are kind of prone to all of this kind of scatter mind, scatter brain kind of effect, and being able to focus on one thing becomes increasingly challenging. And it's actually shown, and there's data to support that multitasking actually inhibits brain development and actually is detrimental to long-term memory establishment. So when you're doing things and you want to remember them, you really have to focus on them and kind of eliminate any other variables.
Did you guys find any connections with circadian rhythms?
I'm sure there's a lot of research, yeah, and especially things like stress hormones and things like that, inhibiting our ability to establish connections and things like that. I'm sure there's a wealth. Yeah, and the chemistry of it, gosh, that's multiple PhDs. Any other questions?
I think social inhibition in the class makes it difficult to cut through some of this.
Oh, for sure. And actually, that's one of the things that I was kind of thinking about when I was writing this is inspiration. Like, how many of you were inspired by teachers that just had this pouring of passion into what they were doing, and that inspired you to become maybe who you are? And it's like when you do that, and that's social, what we call social facilitation, right? In animal behavior, you facilitate the excitement of what you're doing, and others are inspired and want to do that too. And that facilitates their brain development and their ability to remember those things. And I mean, those things are not independent of each other. They are not mutually exclusive. So when you are excited, students are excited. And when they're excited, they're ready. They're ready to learn stuff.
I think it also helps to like build a class culture where students can feel comfortable like engaging in all these sorts of things, right? That's super important.
When we get in lab and interact with stuff, it's a whole different ballgame.
Right, right. Yeah. Absolutely.
We'll put in a plug in Canvas on the left-hand side. We have a tool called StudyMate. If you've turned it off, you might want to turn it back on, but it's what you talked about, self-quizzing or self-studying. Allows students to create those flashcards, crossword puzzles, things like that, based on the set of facts.
Bring people to the same thing too.
Cool.
And handwriting is, they've found, is way more memory producing than typing.
Yes.
So anytime you can encourage the students to handwrite, there's something about it, because they're doing it from that it sinks in a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
So,
The muscle memory.
yeah.
Yeah, I've actually noticed specifically this semester, a lot more students have gone back to handwritten notes. I don't know if you're seeing that in your classes or
We
in your.
actively encourage it.
Yeah, I do too. And it's just like, I've only seen in several classes, like maybe 4 or 5 students with their computers out. Most people have gone back to notebooks, which I love it. I love it. I love to see them engaged in the words and making sure they're paraphrasing and using their own vocabulary, because that's really when they start taking ownership.
Copying tactics.
There was also a couple of Naperville high school teachers a few years back that they were doing these brain breaks. They had these little things, and one of them is simple, especially when students are sitting for a long period of time, where you get them up and you put them, and they found that doing things that required like math and cross-lateral movement. So you would have 2 people across from each other, and you have them start counting from 30 by 2s. So one person would go like 30, 28, the other person would have to come back, doing it out loud. And then you would mess it up and go, okay, 30 by 3s. And then you do something like 47 by 6. And what happens, they're laughing, they're doing it, but it's getting them up. And for some reason, the movement, not only the verbalization, but cross-lateral movement, because they found things like swimming. Students who did swimming, like no more than 2 class periods before a test, were scoring higher. Now that was anecdotal from in their school, but they were seeing these increases of exercise prior to tests. Kind of cool stuff in the brain.
Yeah, well, and anybody who plays drums or piano, they score higher on standardized tests. Those data are out there. And that's like, based on my singing and my tune. That's why I play drums. So, yes, you want me to sing. But yeah, I mean, people, the research is out there for sure, showing that on a standardized test, people who use their limbs and appendages in conjunction with music or whatever their professions are, like they tend to score higher on standardized tests.
I read a great book actually that came out a few years ago that touches on a lot of that. And it's called The Extended Mind. It was fairly popular for a year or so. Anyway, the big idea is that there are these external things that are connected to what's going on in your mind. And so the thing like motion or going outside is also like a way that, you can help the learning process. So yeah, highly recommend that.
Related to that, students learn by their environment too, in a larger sense, when they're studying, if they're laying on their bed, that's going to be very different than how they take their test. If they can focus on like that clock there's probably a clock in every room. If they have one wherever they're studying, that focal point might be beneficial.
Quick question, do you have like a specific time on like clustering or chunking time spent? So I've always said like 20 minutes. That was like the data I had read, but I don't know if there's more reason for that on like how long to really focus intentionally and then take a break.
My short answer is not exactly, but I will follow that up with, have you heard of the Pomodoro method?
Yes.
So I think they use 28 minutes. It's it's not an even number or whatever, but yeah.
Yep.
5-minute break.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's an app called Be Focused. I use it all the time, and it goes 25 minutes and then a break, 25 minutes and a break. That's how I start grading. Because I'm like, I can grade for 25 minutes and take a break.
Thank you.
Did they talk about how group settings even?
Social stuff, yeah, like whenever, and that's why group discussion and things like that, when you have students interacting and their ability to communicate to appear in their own words, the retentions automatically start going up. I don't have the numbers on that exactly, but it was in one of the books I was going through. And the other part of it was having students teach, taking ownership of content during lessons and lesson planning and things like that. If you can divide it equally and give students opportunity to take ownership of that content and teach parts of it, they'll definitely retain that a lot longer, and their peers will be more kind of in tune with the way that they're presenting it. Because again, we're that professional up there. We use the words that we use all the time, and they're not familiar with that. So when they have that kind of peer and social setting and they get that context, they get just kind of better context. They're able to take that information in more readily.
Just a plug. So we teach our tutors actually a much less scientific version of this, primarily because my background is in learning and not in neurobiology or any of that. So, but these are the kinds of things that our tutors are working with students on, that interleaving that practice, the self-test, and those kinds of things, building the habits to be able to do that, because often those students that are having trouble with that don't have any knowledge of how to do that on their own. So if a student is coming in with notes, then we're helping to quiz them to show them how to do that self-test. And so if you have a student who's struggling to get these strategies, even as you're introducing them in class, send them to us and we can work on with the content material, through all of these different strategies.
Perfect, thank you.
That's great. Yeah.
Sorry for the plug.
No,
Yeah, no.
that's great.
Thank you.
That's super great.
I think that's something I've seen in my classes, is the students that actually form strong friendships. They form their groups, they tend to do better than others. Versus the solos that don't connect with others.
Yeah, always encourage study groups, always encourage dialogue. I always like I had with you in the beginning, I always tell them to talk to their neighbor, ask them a question. I usually give them a prompt. Last semester it was all about zombie biology and whether or not that would work. We still haven't concluded whether or not zombies can swim. But, I give them something ridiculous to talk about, and then I give them something serious. And they laugh, they have a good time, and then they get serious. And it's a natural progression. Every day they know something stupid's going to come out of my mouth, and then they get to laugh at me, and then they get to talk about something that's meaningful. And it builds the rapport, it gives them that human side of it, and it makes them, again, more open and more comfortable to having those conversations.
Almost makes me want to take a biology class.
Almost. All right, thank you very much, everybody.
I mean, to get to hear you say something stupid.
Oh, I say something stupid all the time.
Yeah, we did online survey, then you try to